In this video, we're going to talk about Jesus as an historical figure. Now, there's very little doubt that Jesus actually existed as a person, as an individual in first century Palestine. But there are a couple of caveats inevitably to that statement. First of all, although he is referred to by other accounts that were written down and were discussed and were expressed fairly widely, the actual evidence of him existing, like, for example, a birth certificate or a death certificate, has as yet not been found and is unlikely ever to be found because those sorts of things didn't exist then. However, did a figure called Jesus live and minister in Palestine in the first century? Yes, we know that from a number of different sources. First of all, we have a figure called Josephus, who wrote a history of the Jewish people and included mention of Jesus as a leader of a sect of Christians called the Way. And he had, Josephus at least, had no particular incentive to mention Jesus other than as a prominent local individual and local holy man in his area. The main body of information that we have regarding the historical figure of Jesus is, of course, from the Bible, and we would consider those to be probably secondary accounts, secondary sources. That is to say, they are written about Jesus, possibly from eyewitness accounts or by eyewitnesses. But again, the actual provenance of a lot of that information, where it's coming from, is sometimes quite difficult to work out, and we only have some conjecture about where these documents came from, and also some sort of text analysis in order to determine where they might potentially come from. I have spoken in other videos about the Gospels and the Epistles in very general terms, but it might be worth just thinking about a timeline to give us a sense of how all this fits together. Jesus is historically meant to have been born in the year 0, obviously between 1 BC and 1 AD. In fact, his birth was probably a little bit later than that, and it might have been as late as about 6 CE, Christian era, or Common Era. Probably not much later than that, and estimates have also put his birth as slightly before the year 0, so at 4 BC. But for the purposes of this exercise and for our number charts, let's just go with something like 5 or 6 CE in the Common Era. So we can tell from the texts, mainly from the New Testament, from the Gospels, that Jesus' ministry started at roughly about 29 or 30 years old and lasted for roughly about 3 years. And this is based on the accounts of the seasons and the passage of time. And so that places his death at the age of 33 at somewhere around 38 or 39 CE. Now, as I say, estimates vary about the accuracy of these dates, and you might think 2,000 years later that it's baffling and incomprehensible as to why we would not be able to pin such an important date down to the day or the month. There are quite a few date stamps, if you like, in the texts. Most of them relate to Jewish holidays and particular events in and around Jerusalem through the life of Jesus. And so we have some kind of idea of the passage of events and when they occurred. But one of the difficulties and the challenges is that we don't really know where we've started from, if you see what I mean. We don't know where we've ended up. But let's say that Jesus was crucified around about 38 AD. The first of Paul's letters that were written by him was 52 at the latest, maybe as early as 50 AD, so within about 12 years of the death of Christ, and probably no more than about 15 years. So these are evidence of recent events, but of course we need to remember that Paul wasn't an eyewitness. He based his information on other stories that he had heard. The first big document, the first big story in the Christian era after the death of Christ was the Council of Jerusalem, which happened in the mid to late 40s AD, and this was a conversation principally between St. Peter, St. Andrew, St. Paul, and St. James about the future of the Christian faith, or the faith they called the Way. They saw themselves very much as a Jewish sect at that stage, and they were following a particularly important rabbi, holy man and prophet called Jesus. But St. Paul, who came to things a little bit later and was struck blind by Jesus on the road to Damascus and became a convert to Christianity, held that for the Christian faith to thrive, it needed to get away from its Jewish roots. And again, we'll talk about that in a great deal of detail on another video. But this is the first time that these fathers of the church, as it were, these significant leaders of the church, had come together to discuss some significant issues about direction. And that was within about 10 years of the death of Christ. And so you can see, again, the pace of change and the speed with which the life of Christ and his teachings had really taken hold and really engaged with a lot of people in that region. So, as I said, Paul is starting to write at about 50, within about a year or two of that, probably, and then kept going for another 10 years on top of that until he died. At this stage, he's the only person who's actually written anything down, and along came eventually the man who wrote Mark, the Gospel of Mark, attributed to Mark, probably not written by Mark, but that's again one of those historical things that we'll talk about elsewhere. And that was principally an oral history or a narrative history of what had happened and what the writer Mark could remember about the life of Christ. Because, of course, you remember that Christ had promised to come again, and that this was felt to be a very immediate and very this was going to happen very soon, and so therefore everyone needed to prepare themselves. But after 10 or 15 years, it became obvious that perhaps this wasn't as immediate as everyone had thought, and so they thought, well, we better start writing some of this down. A huge investment in time and money to actually write these stories down. But it was, again, considered really, really important to get the story straight and also to be able to inform other people who, in this now burgeoning religion that was now spreading around the world, and it was important to have consistency in the stories and how they were conveyed. And so this person, Mark, wrote down the first of the Gospels. History tells us... and it's quite a nice story, I think, that it was actually the memories of St. Peter who recounted these stories to St. Mark. It's a very short story. This first Gospel only contains the main points. And probably is very much a narrative version of an oral history. So we have St. Mark. Somebody else enterprisingly wrote down something called Q, which is a list of the sayings of Jesus. That original document is now lost to us, but it was incorporated into two subsequent Gospels, which were written some years after the Gospel of Mark. They were the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Written for particular communities, principally in the case of Luke, a Greek-speaking community, so starting to talk about the wider world, and he added also the book of Acts. So we had Luke and Acts involved itself very much in the early days of the church, and from whence we get so much information about the Council of Jerusalem. Mentioned before. So there's the Gospel of Matthew, which was written pretty much for a Jewish organization, but Matthew was very much of the view that the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem had got things wrong, had persecuted Jesus for the wrong reasons, had tried to, had deliberately avoided facing some of the questions that Jesus had raised, and also was able to capture very much more of the sort of the lyric quality of Jesus' ministry, and probably recounting a number of stories and perhaps songs that had been told about Jesus, and that were a way of transmitting information very accurately across generations and across long distances. So they would sing the songs. And if you look at chapter 5, particularly in the Gospel of Matthew, you'll see there the Sermon on the Mount has a very lyrical quality and is seen as a very sort of short but detailed statement about the kingdom of God and Jesus' views about that. Really important. So the key thing to remember is that Jesus himself doesn't have a birth certificate, and he doesn't have a death certificate, but he's talked about in a lot of different ways. And he's also spoken of in relatively short order within only a few years of his death and his resurrection. And these stories are recounted to others essentially as they were reputed to have occurred, and some of the variation between some of the Gospels can be accounted by local requirements and different audiences who would be able to understand different nuances. But one of the most amazing things about the life of Christ is actually how much we know about Jesus, and actually how much of it is virtually eyewitness accounts. So whatever else we may think about the life of Christ, and whether or not these things did or did not occur to our post-Reformation, post-Enlightenment scientific rationalist minds, certainly for the people at the time, all of the cues were there, all of the things, the building blocks that were required for the faith were in place. And one of the most important things to remember is that the speed with which the faith in Christ and the faith of Christ spread around the Mediterranean and the known world in such a relatively short period of time is testimony, I think, not only to the appeal of the stories, but also to the truth of the claims. So with those thoughts, I shall leave you, but I would encourage you to not only read the Gospel, all of the Gospels with an open mind, but also to seek to explore some of the writings of St. Paul particularly, and some of the urgency and some of the insistence and some of the images that he was able to conjure up within a few short years of the death of Christ.